This crime was such a tragedy. It's a case that should have never happened. Mildred Borowski was a 71-year-old widow who went out with friends to celebrate her birthday.
But by the next morning, Mildred Borowski had disappeared.
This case was somewhat unusual because it involved 3 separate scenes, and each of these scenes tell us something about the perpetrator.
But will these clues help solve the mystery of what happened to Mildred Borowski and reveal who's responsible?
We were able to really help to focus this investigation, but there were still some surprises in the end.
On a breezy spring morning, residents in the close-knit community of New Port Richey, Florida, notice something strange. An indoor cat belonging to one of their neighbors is wandering alone outside the house. The cat's owner, Mildred Borowski, has let newspapers pile up in her front yard and isn't answering her door. And this isn't the only sign that something's not right. A few hours later, Deputy Dale Hutchinson is dispatched to check on reports of a car abandoned in a nearby wooded lot.
When I found the car, it was in a spot where most people don't leave vehicles. It's in a secluded area, out behind a subdivision.
The car belongs to Mildred Borowski, but the vehicle hasn't been reported stolen, and it's in perfect condition. There's no cause to search the car, but the situation seems unusual enough that Hutchinson decides to follow up.
The fact that the vehicle was left in the woods and in a strange place, and in that condition, I decided to go over to her house to check to see if the car was stolen and not reported yet.
The widow of a retired police chief, Mildred Borowski has been a well-known member of the community for 17 years. Neighbors are used to seeing her out walking her poodle several times a day. But no one has seen her in over 24 hours. Officer Hutchinson arrives at her house with a mounting sense of dread.
I immediately got suspicious and I walked around the side of the house. And when I did, I noticed the phone lines were cut. Then I walked around behind the house, and that's when I saw the screen was cut. And when he looked inside the screen room area, there was another window, and it was shattered out.
Hutchinson immediately calls for backup. He has no idea what he'll find inside.
It looked like people ransacked the place. All the phones were ripped out of the phone connections in the walls. The bedroom, there was blood on the walls. That's the first thing I saw. And then when I pulled out this comforter that was surrounding the bottom of the bed, it was filled with blood. Somebody was either hurt real bad in this room or killed.
Several items of value are missing from the home, but there is no sign of Mildred Borowski or her poodle. But Pasco County Sheriff's Detective Jeff Busquet has an idea where to look. He wants to know what's inside the trunk of Borowski's car.
This is the general location that we found the victim's vehicle in. After processing the crime scene, our biggest fear was that we would locate the victim in the back of the trunk.
But there is nothing inside. Mildred Borowski is still missing.
We didn't locate anything in the trunk. From then, we proceeded up to the driver's side door. And upon getting to the door, we observed twigs stuffed inside the key assembly, trying to prevent us from entering into this particular crime scene. We then used Slim Jims to get the door open, and from there we went in and began our processing of this particular crime scene.
Inside the car, investigators find an oven mitt and in the back seat, traces of blood. But they still have no clues to the whereabouts of Mildred Borowski, or whether she's dead or alive. The search is on.
Shortly after noon today, search crews were back in the area where the abandoned car was found in hopes of finding some clues as to what happened to Mildred Borowski.
In the race for answers, even the neighbors volunteer to help.
Well, I was very upset. I didn't realize that anything had happened, never heard a thing.
It's devastating. She was such a nice old lady. And now we don't know what we're going to do. Everybody's upset.
But the searchers find nothing. Then, 2 days later, two boys taking a shortcut home through an overgrown field stumble on a body hidden in the tall grass.
When I got to the field, located on the ground was what appeared to be a female, partially nude, laying on what appeared to be a pillow, and a pillow on top of her head.
The woman is Mildred Borowski. She has been sexually assaulted and murdered. But the police don't know much beyond that.
There was markings in the sand that were indicative of drag marks, but nothing that you could sit there and say that this is how she was actually taken in. We didn't know why the pillow underneath the head was put there. We had no solid suspects on this case, so we called in the FDLE profilers.
When detectives are trained as profilers, we look at cases from all over the world and see what other offenders have done and what this means about what type of person they are. We all felt that the placement of the pillows in the pillowcase at the murder scene were very important to this investigation. It could have been that the offender had some regard for the victim or he wanted to conceal his identity from her, but we all felt that the offender knew the victim.
2 days after disappearing from her home in Newport Richey, Mildred Borowski has been found murdered. Police know she was taken to a nearby field and shot, but they don't know why or by whom. Detectives hope profiler Dale Hinman will be able to find some answers.
This investigation was very complicated and there was a lot of issues that needed to be resolved. One of the issues was whether or not the victim was killed at the location where she was discovered or killed somewhere else and moved to this spot.
The answer could give her a clue to the kind of killer she's looking for. And medical examiner Dr. Marie Hansen can help.
You're looking for evidence, blood evidence that says you've got an injury and then the body was moved. So if you've got a gunshot wound and then you move the body, you're expecting blood to start flowing as it normally does. In this case, you have tall weeds, you're going to get parts of weeds and things on the body.
But in this case, examiners find no evidence that the victim was moved after she was shot.
There's no attached dirt, there's no attached grass, so it appears that she was carried in and laid down, and then they shot her.
For Hinman, the information is more than a report on the killer's movements. It's also a behavioral clue about the killer himself.
We also saw great significance in the movement of the victim from the privacy of her home to the field. This represents really high-risk behavior on the part of the offender.
With the first profile points in hand, Agent Hinman is ready for the next piece of the puzzle. She meets with Detective Busquet to reconstruct the crime. They start where the killer started, with Borowski's house.
This is a blow-up of the crime scene. We're going to start from the side here and work our way up. We come to the side of the residence where the actual telephone line is cut leading inside the residence. Subjects come through into the backyard to come here to Exhibit B, where they come through a screen room. The subject comes into the screen room. Subject works its way to the window that's leading from the screen room into the kitchen. That actual window is broken out.
This individual's method of entry is not very sophisticated. It seems like to me that if he was a more experienced burglar, he could have got into this residence a variety of different ways, or if he had more personal confidence, he could have knocked on the door and waited for the victim to get up and come to the door.
Hinman now believes the killer is a relatively inexperienced criminal, And as she continues to track his movements into the bedroom, even the path he walked reveals something about him.
There's nothing that's thrown over, nothing that's bumped over. It's a straight path to that particular room.
And there's no indication of any other searching throughout the house. It's as if the person knew the victim would be here and where her purse would be and where any items of value would be. He doesn't have any ransacking or searching in any of the other rooms of the home.
No, none at all. We've gone through it all.
To Hinman, the reason is clear. Not only did the killer know Borowski, he knew her well.
The offender in this case might have been in the house before, because after he broke into the residence, he went straight to the victim, and the fact that he killed her makes me think that he killed her to prevent her from identifying him.
And Agent Hinman has an idea where they could start looking for him.
Searching throughout the house.
Because the crime also involved a sexual assault, she suggests investigators look for offenders living in the neighborhood who might have had prior contact with Mrs. Borowski. One man immediately stands out. A recently released sex offender living only blocks away from Mrs. Borowski.
There was indication that we had from one of the lead sheets that did in fact state that he, quote, and off the lead sheet, got turned on with older people.
Investigators immediately begin to look at the offender down the street. But they need proof. And the blood in Mrs. Borowski's bedroom and car could provide the answer. When body of evidence returns, will forensic evidence tie the sex offender down the street to Mildred Borowski's murder? A week after the murder of Mildred Borowski, a sex offender living nearby is a promising suspect.
We knew the victim had been sexually assaulted, and we all thought that the victim knew her offender and recognized him, so a person with a sexual offender history who lived in the neighborhood had to be looked at as a suspect.
And investigators hope the blood in Mrs. Borowski's bedroom and car will be the proof they've been looking for. DNA analyst Billy Shumway is the one who'll try to find it.
The investigators were hoping that we would find blood from the suspect that we could do DNA on that might lead them to a suspect or help them identify a suspect. But when we examined it, we determined that the blood was not human.
If it's not human, it can't belong to the sex offender down the street. But whose is it? Shumway has a theory she wants to test.
Once we determined that the blood from the crime scene was not human blood, the next step was to determine what type of blood it might be. In this case, we knew the victim had a dog, so we tested it for dog blood.
Could the mystery blood belong to Mrs. Borowski's missing poodle?
In this case, we put the anti-dog serum in the center well, and that was surrounded by samples from the crime scene and known standards. Once that anti-dog serum reacts with our known sample, what we're going to expect to happen is these antibodies will join with the dog blood, and we're going to see a nice dark white line there between the wells. You see that? It looks like a chalk line.
Shumway is correct. The blood in Mrs. Borowski's house and car belongs to the victim's missing poodle. There is no forensic evidence tying the murder to the sex offender down the street. And soon, it doesn't matter. The man has an alibi. Detectives are coming up empty-handed.
We had no forensic evidence whatsoever on this particular case. The only way we were going to make a case with this case was to actually find the killer and hope that he confessed to it.
But in the hands of a veteran profiler, every detail is a potential clue.
Finding out that the blood in the victim's bedroom actually belonged to the victim's dog was very important and significant to us, and it could have meant two things. Either the offender was very cruel, or he knew that if he let the victim's dog out, the dog wouldn't run away, but would just stand and bark in front of the door, which would alert the neighbors. And if that was true, then this meant that the offender knew the victim.
It's another sign that her initial profile is on target. But Hinman is sure there are still clues waiting to be uncovered. Clues that will tell her even more about the killer they're searching for. She and Detective Busquet go to the field where the body was found to review the final moments of the crime.
Dale, this is the actual field that we found Mrs. Borowski in. She was found over in that area. The thing about finding her was she was actually laid down on the field. She had the pillowcase over, actually covering her face, a pillow underneath her head, and a pillow on top of her head.
The covering of the victim's face with the pillowcase and the pillow over and the pillow underneath makes it seem like perhaps this is a very personal crime, or that he's very inexperienced and doesn't really want to look at her when he shoots her.
I agree.
And this isn't the first clue that has made Agent Hinman think the killer is inexperienced. The evidence at Borowski's house and car also pointed to an unsophisticated offender. Hinman reaches a startling conclusion.
Well, everything we've talked about so far makes me feel like this is possibly a juvenile.
Could the killer they're looking for actually be a teenager? Intriguingly, one teenager is already associated with the investigation. One of the neighbors who volunteered to help search for Borowski is 18-year-old Jonathan Grimshaw.
And now we don't know what we're going to do. Everybody's upset. I'm sure everybody around here will miss her a lot.
And Grimshaw's age isn't the only thing that makes Agent Hinman want to take a closer look.
We know from past cases that offenders often interject themselves into an investigation, and one of the reasons why they do this is they want to know what it is that the police know. And when John Grimshaw interjected himself into this investigation and offered his services as a tracker, this made him suspicious.
Coming up next, could helpful neighborhood teen Jonathan Grimshaw really be the cold-blooded killer investigators are searching for? 18-year-old neighbor Jonathan Grimshaw has emerged as a prime suspect in the murder of Mildred Borowski. A junior at Gulf High School, Grimshaw seems an unlikely perpetrator for the crime. He is an average student with no history of violence. But the teenager is exactly the type of perpetrator Agent Hinman expected to find.
It's devastating. She was such a nice old lady.
Jonathan Grimshaw fit the type of personality and the other characteristics that we would have been looking for. He was a juvenile, he lived in the area, he was criminally inexperienced.
Detectives decide to bring Grimshaw in for an interview, but with no physical evidence, they need a confession to solve the case. In this taped interview, Detective Busquet attempts to get one. Busquet takes hours to go over the crime again and again. But to get a confession, he needs Grimshaw to trust him.
And he said, will you still be my friend? And I said, I just want to know what's going on. Of course, I'll still be your friend. And subsequently, he admitted to it all.
What did you use to cut telephone wire outside? And what was used to cut the screen?
Investigators speculate that what started out as a simple robbery escalated into sexual assault and ended in murder. But in a shocking twist, Grimshaw says he didn't do it alone. Grimshaw named 17-year-old classmate Nathan Ramirez as his accomplice. But how is this possible? Throughout the investigation, no one, including Agent Hinman, thought there was more than one perpetrator. Is Grimshaw lying, or were investigators wrong? Agent Hinman has seen this before.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This would only require one person to do this, or one person who the victim was frightened of or who had a weapon. So in this crime, all you can really see are the actions of one person. Profilers and detectives can't see somebody if they're standing and watching.
Hinman is right. When confronted, Nathan Ramirez leads investigators to a ring stolen from Mildred Borowski and to the murder weapon.
Question, you don't know if Nathan Ramirez was present? Mr. Martin's question.
In a 4-day trial, Grimshaw and Ramirez are found guilty of first-degree murder.
Yes or no?
Grimshaw is currently serving life in prison. Ramirez's case is under appeal.
Question.
Mildred Borowski was a kind and gentle woman who could have been anybody's mother or grandmother. The most she should have ever had to worry about was what she was going to wear that day or what she was going to have for dinner. We can't bring Mrs. Borowski back to her friends and family, but when we all worked together as a team, we were able to bring them justice.